Thank you so much for joining us after lunch. I knew we would lose a few people, but I'm very heartened to see how many of you came back to learn more. I had a couple of questions come up over lunch, so I thought I'd just address those real quickly before I introduce our speaker. One was the very good question, what's the difference in the CCC and the WPA? And so this is a very layman description of it. I'm sure the historians are going to cringe a little bit because I'm going to bring it way down. But basically, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, were young, unmarried men, and they would go to a camp and live together and work on that site and have no skills necessarily to do it, but they were trained and they did it together. Whereas the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, focused more, not completely, but more on family men, and they didn't go live in a tent with the other guys. They lived in a community, and then they lent their skills to that area. So there are many more subtleties, but did I nail it good enough? Okay. So hopefully that helps explain the difference. As Lynda will mention, the New Deal is full of all these acronyms, and truthfully, a lot of people don't know. They go to a state park and they see a sign about the WPA and they don't know what it means. So those are very valid questions. I hope you had a chance to look at the resource table with all these books. I picked out at least 3 that I haven't read that I would like to get. We have some of the current publications in our gift shop, so you might go check that out if you're interested. But wonderful resources. So thank you to everyone who brought those. Let's see. Anything else I need to mention before I move on? Thank you so much for being here. This is just really, I've heard such wonderful comments, and I'm so pleased by all the networking that's going on and just the passion in this room for saving history. So thank you for being those kind of people. All right. Michael Mays is the survey coordinator in the State Register of Historic Places coordinator for the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office. Michael is a native Oklahoman, obtaining a BA in history and an MA in museum studies. Michael's research interests include the Depression and the Dust Bowl era, the Cold War, and sociocultural anthropology. Wow, I should have practiced that one. Michael is able to contribute further research on these subjects through his position while expanding on and maintaining data for the Oklahoma Landmarks Inventory and the National Register of Historic Places through guidelines established by the National Park Service. All right, please welcome Michael Mays.
Thank you. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing at the State Historic Preservation Office as far as the state parks and how they're related to the CCC. I'm not going to go into a lot of the history since Mr. Blackburn already covered that, but I will start with just a brief history of Oklahoma's New Deal era state parks. March 31st, 1933, Congress enacts legislation creating the Civilian Conservation Corps to furnish employment and training for unemployed youth. The CCC camps established in conjunction with the National Park Service to develop national and state parks. And the CCC would provide labor for conservation projects while rehabilitating young men void of spiritual and physical nourishment. So President Roosevelt believed that the national and state parks would inspire in Americans a pioneering spirit stressing individualism, hard work, and moral character. This picture here is a picture of the Lewis L. Hawkins collection that is located at the Oklahoma History Center, and this is of Perry Lake and Boiling Springs, these black and white pictures that you'll see in my presentation. Mr. Hawkins was an engineer hired through the CCC to design the culverts and pathways. Thankfully, he had the presence of mind to take a camera with him while he was working on these projects. And I'm not sure if this is Boiling Springs or Perry. These were not labeled on the back. This one I do know is Perry Lake. This is also from the Lewis L. Hawkins collection. This shows CCC workers at Perry Lake. And you can see the boathouse in the background if you're familiar with Perry Lake. I wanted to include this mainly because of the contrast. If you look at the bottom, you can see the horses pulling what would appear to be like a road grader. But then if you also look right here, you've got a bulldozer. So you've got the contrast of this period, not only having horsepower, but going into the diesel pulled engines. Again, here's some more horsepower from the Lewis L. Hawkins collection. Horses were a little bigger back then, I think. Yeah. The CCC was responsible for various conservation projects designed to revitalize overworked agricultural land, reverse soil erosion, and implement reforestation. CCC labor, in conjunction with the National Park Service, developed national and state parks of distinctive architecture and craftsmanship that would be accessible to all Americans. Again, this is either Boiling Springs or Perry Lake. I wish they would have labeled them, but I'm glad we got them. So past survey efforts, what our office has done. In 1993, the New Deal era state park survey of 10 state parks was completed. The 1993 survey concluded that the area of significance encompassed the New Deal and CCC related resources from 1933 to 1942. But it also broadened to include some resources constructed by the WPA. Now, this is not by any means a complete list of parks in Oklahoma with CCC and New Deal era state resources. Current efforts. So this is basically what we've been doing, what I've been doing. So the SHPO, my department, began resurveying state parks in late 2021, starting with Lake Murray. State parks surveyed from 2021 to 2023 include Lake Murray, Beavers Bend, Boiling Springs, and Quartz Mountain. So the purpose of this survey is to assess the still extant CCC era resources and to aid in recommendations for future rehabilitation of these resources. So survey work, what I do, it consists of field visits, photographing the resources, and the use of historic and current aerial photos to collect the appropriate data. That data is then uploaded to the Oklahoma Landmarks Inventory, which is what you see here. And I'm sure it's hard to read back there. But this, whenever you go to our Oklahoma Landmarks Inventory, on the website there, oklahomahistory.org, you can find anything that we have surveyed, any of the resources, including these state parks. This is a picture of one of the CCC Broken Bow cabins that is uploaded to the Oklahoma Landmarks Inventory. And what is on the page here would be everything from the architectural style to its exact location, and then it will list everything from what its designation is as far as how it relates to the CCC era, if the known architect is whoever built it, things like that. SHPO makes a determination of contributing and non-contributing resources to each state park per the National Park Service guidelines. Lake Murray State Park was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2001. Lake Murray has a total of 305 resources. Of those resources, 195 are contributing and 110 are non-contributing. So what is considered contributing? The property basically must convey significance through integrity, through location, design, settings, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. Lake Murray is one of 2 state parks with formerly segregated resources still extant. Romanos would be the other one. And this is a picture of one of these segregated cabins from Lake Murray. Beavers Bend State Park was determined eligible for National Register listing by consensus in 2001. The SHPO site investigation in 2022 that I was a part of confirmed 16 resources as contributing. Resources include cabins, the bathhouse, culverts, and the nature center. During the survey, one of the things that SHPO staff did, we discussed with park staff at Beavers Bend the maintenance issues, including leaking roofs on some of the CCC built cabins. Real quick investigation of these roofs uncovered that mainly the biggest problem was just improperly installed flashing that was causing leaks down into the cabins. This cabin was the caretaker's residence during the time that the CCC was building Beavers Bend State Park, the cabins and things like that. And you can actually, if you go to Beavers Bend now, you can rent this out and stay in this cabin. Boiling Spring State Park has 22 contributing resources, including 11 group cabins, the community building, the water tower, several culverts and bridges, and a rock pond and dam that were all designed and constructed by the CCC. This is a picture of one of the CCC cabins where the workers would have stayed in once it was built. Recent renovations at Boiling Springs around the visitor center have incorporated the National Park Service and CCC rustic architectural style. So the photo at the left is of the CCC built pump house. The photo at the right is of the placard that's commemorating the park as a CCC built state park. And then this is a current photo of part of the visitor center. So if you notice in looking in that, you can see the rustic architecture from the National Park Service has been incorporated as part of the addition to this. Boiling Spring State Park Community Building built by the CCC labor. Very distinctive architecture. The CCC was also responsible for many of the bridges and culverts still in operation today. This picture shows the CCC workers on a bridge at Perry Lake. And then this is a current photo of that same bridge. This is a picture of the Boiling Spring State Park CCC built bridge. Again, you can still see just kind of all the architecture follows the same NPS guidelines. This is a bridge at Perry Lake with a few CCC workers and Mr. Hawkins in the middle, and I'm assuming that's his car behind him. Anybody know what that would be? No car enthusiast? Old. And this is the current view of driving over that bridge. By the fall of 2023, SHPO had completed survey work on Quartz Mountain State Park. SHPO has yet to prepare any further documentation on the remaining state parks and the CCC resources. There are over 25 contributing resources identified at Quartz Mountain, including group cabins, fire shelters, community house, and the pump house. This is a picture of the fire shelter at Quartz Mountain State Park. Again, this was CCC labor that built this. Yes?
The one just before this,
Uh-huh.
that's where we had our Girl Scout camps when I was growing up. And this was the one that was furthest up the mountain. And that's the one where we wanted to stay because the council was too tired to get up.
I took this picture so I can relate. Yeah, I was huffing and puffing, but it was beautiful scenery down there. If you've never been, I highly recommend it. And you can stay in these cabins. They also have cabins across the road from it that kind of overlook the lake that you can also stay at too. This is the Quartz Mountain State Park pump house. You notice the cannonball architecture, which if you've been to southwestern Oklahoma, you'll see all over. These were quarried out of the area. They are naturally forming rocks that were used all over southwest Oklahoma. This is another example of a CCC constructed culvert. Again, nothing that you would actually probably notice, but next time you're at any of these state parks, they're still there, they're still functional. And then this is the dam at Quartz Mountain, which is also part of CCC labor. We have a lot of resources in Oklahoma for WPA area. So ongoing efforts, what are we doing right now? So for the SHPO, we're conducting desktop reviews of the remaining state parks to organize possible number of resources for future surveys. We are organizing what information we can in-house through the use of GIS mapping and things like that. And then the other thing is ongoing cataloging and digitizing of historic documents, which would include blueprints, warranty deeds, communication letters, photographs, etc. This is an example. This is a blueprint that our office has that we're digitizing right now. Scroll down to my notes to make sure I get this one right. Yeah, so this is Spavinall Hills. This was the caretaker residence of Spavinall Hills. Here's another blueprint. This is a digitized Lake Murray Superintendent's Residence blueprint. It's another example of how we are preserving these documents. And this is a current picture of the former blueprints of the superintendent's cabin. So that's just some of the efforts that we're doing to preserve this at our office. One last photo. These are CCC labor workers. This would be either at Perry Lake or at Bowling Springs. So anybody got questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just wondering, we're looking at a lot of the state parts of the WPA structures that are built there. There's a lot federal property that a lot of WPA structures are on. Does the state deal with that, or does the feds deal with those WPA structures?
That'd be a good question for my boss, who I'm going to introduce here in just a minute. She's going to cover that. Before we get to her, are there any others? Yes, ma'am.
Didn't the CCC do the shelter belts too?
Yes, CCC built the shelter belts, and I was looking into that. If you don't know what the shelter belts are, the laborers went in and planted tree rows during the Dust Bowl era. Basically, it was to, the idea was to protect from any more soil erosion and blowing and stuff like that. I guess they were responsible for that.
Where's the first one in the state?
Oh, man. There's a historical marker there. Is it Frederick? Mangum. Willow.
A lot of the farmers forget what that was for, and they're taking them out.
Yeah. Yeah, there's one. We got a call from somebody in western Oklahoma, and there's actually one if you're driving down a dirt road that is in the middle of the road, and the county has, up until now, graded around it. So you kind of it's just in the middle of nowhere. And she said that her dad was part of the crew that built that. And so she was asking us if there was much of anything that we could do to preserve that, protect it, or anything, which probably not. But.
You know, they had their standard trees evidently, but then I know that my daddy asked for apricot trees,
Yeah.
and we had Russian olives out there, and the thorns were this long, and on the Russian olives, it was terrible if you stepped on them.
Yeah.
But the apricot trees were, of course, none of that is making it anymore.
No. Kind of harder to. Yeah.
The red cedars are about the only thing still.
Yeah. And don't get me started on red cedars. That's why my voice is so messed up right now.
Well, they're the one thing that block the wind.
I know. Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, this is my contact information. We're also back there. I have business cards. If there's anything that our office can help out with, please reach out to us. That's why we're there. Now I get to introduce my wonderful boss. All right. So Lynda Ozan is the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer for Oklahoma. She is an Ohio native. She has degrees in both history and historic preservation and brings over 25 years of preservation experience to the state of Oklahoma. Lynda's research interest includes settlement patterns, indentured servitude, and modern architectural styles. Her research contributes to the understanding of the relationships between people and place, as well as the character of communities. Miss Lynda Ozan.
So much worse. Besides just reading my intro. I don't know about that. Okay. So I think Amy might have forgotten that we changed or deleted my presentation that was kind of the alphabet soup of the New Deal. So that'll come later. But today, which I think is why, here we go. Why many of you stayed after lunch is because I'm talking about money, right? Everybody wants to know how to fund their project and where you can find the sources for funding. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. My presentation is actually geared to be an hour long, so you're getting a very condensed version of it. So, traditional sources, that's what we all tend to rely on, right? Fundraising comes in many formats: themed galas, merchandise sales, events, tours, and other activities that rely on registration fees, sales, sponsorships. Those are very important sources of revenue and usually help organizations raise their discretionary funds. Note, I included some photos from here. You're welcome. I know my audience. In contrast, grants funded through the government, corporate entities, and foundations are almost always programs or project related. They tend to be competitive and require you to make a well-conceived, defensible case for funding your project. So what's your project? In the field of historic preservation, we assign value to our projects in the following ways. Architecture. It is the most obvious thing to fund. The craftsmanship, solid construction, use of materials, and precedent-setting designs give credibility to calls for their restoration. When compatible uses can be found, the case becomes even more compelling. Such projects tend to require inordinate amounts of intervention and planning, and ultimately loads and loads of money. We usually can make a strong case for their architectural and historic values and the desirable qualities that are found in these buildings. Quality of life. It is often the greatest contribution to a cultural resource project that it makes to the community. Emphasis here can be on things such as the value of the buildings, the planning and zoning policies that protect the community, affordability, and cultural vibrancy. Here, in the Sapulpa project, the community prioritized character, walkability, and safety over economic return. The initiative to protect the historic character and scale has gained support from the merchants, health professionals, and developers who understand that walkability and access to services foster better outcomes for their community. Historical and cultural associations. The Threet Filling Station represents not only a building preservation win, but also a win for documentation, interpreting, and sharing an important American story. In this case, the history of the African American experience in Oklahoma, as well as along Route 66. Like, this is not only the capitalization of their adaptive potential, but also on their rich historical associations. Economic development. Economic development is another way we position cultural resources in grant writing. Since the early 1970s, cultural resource stewards and activists have been highlighting the impressive economic development potential of building reuse and community revitalization. Enid's Main Street, shown here, through the years has attracted financial investment, other economic incentives, and planning considerations based on an anticipated strong economic return on investment, including job creation, increased sales revenue, property taxes, and more. Projects that can be positioned with clear economic outcomes and hailed for their catalysts in their communities are well positioned to seek funding. So how do you find sources? Because that's really what you all want to know, right? Where's the money? So Candidates Foundation Directory is by far the largest database of nonprofit funding sources, detailing the funding source's mission, application process, deadline, and information about past grant recipients. You can purchase a subscription through the directory for an annual fee or access it at a public library in your community. While comprehensive and highly searchable, the directory can be daunting. It might appear to offer hundreds of possible matches for your specific project, but those matches will need to be further vetted to understand exactly what they'll fund. Never underestimate the power of Google. Type in key terms: funding for economic development, funding for historic preservation, things like that. The possibilities are endless, and the search will yield lots of exciting leads. But like those on other search engines, they will need to be further vetted to see if your project really fits their criteria. Keep in mind that while these searches sound promising, many organizations do not accept unsolicited proposals. Governmental sources. This is kind of a fun one right now. So, in the past, when people call our office, I tell them, we at the State Historic Preservation Office haven't had funds to do restoration for buildings since the 1980s, and the likelihood that we will see money to do restoration is slim to none. And honestly, that hasn't changed. However, the funding at the federal level has increased substantially, and I can't remember a time in the past 25 years where federal money has been more prevalent for these types of projects. So agencies like the National Park Service have fully funded the Save America's Treasures program and other underrepresented community grants, which brings substantial funding to the table. But you also need to look at comparable projects. Look at places that have had already received money and find projects that are similar to yours, right? So you want to look for buildings that are similar in your region or your community. Investigate where those projects secured funding to find your own source of funding for projects. And the best source of information is your own network. Your board members, city or county commission members, peer organizations, even peer organizations in related fields, and most especially your current funders. A not very well kept secret is that funders tend to talk to one another, right? And so no foundation, government agency, or institution will ever be able to give away enough money to meet the needs for the projects that they care about. But it's in their best interest to know where people can find other financial resources to help with those types of projects. So they're willing to talk to you to help find those sources of funds to do your project. They can also be a champion for your project if you structure it in such ways. So what are the tactics? Now that you've found a source that you want to seek money from, how do you get it out of them, right? You need to make that compelling and credible case for your project. So let's run through a few ways that you can do that to position yourself to get the money. So, know your audience, have your conversations, be really good at storytelling, and show the progression of your project. So audiences, there's no distinction between advocacy and fundraising, right? In both, you are seeking support for some kind of project you believe in. The surest way to their pocketbook is through their heart. If you are approaching a fundraising source, you likely already know that they care about your project. Look carefully at how the funding sources work and how their mission statements are worded, what kind of criteria they use, and what are the requirements for their grants. Look even closer at the projects they have funded in the past. Try to highlight the features of your project and describe its benefits using the terms you find in their documents and project descriptions. You cannot lie. If you sense that the funder is particularly interested in senior living or welfare, for example, then figure out if there are ways your project will benefit that demographic. Similarly, if the foundation has a strong green bent, focus on the aspect of your project that increase energy efficiency or other ways that you reduce the climate impact. I'm not suggesting that you simply parrot what you've read, but I urge you to understand what these organizations are about and the types of projects that they fund. Communication is a two-way street, and where there is a relationship, communication becomes easy and enjoyable, even beneficial to your project. Most funders consider themselves partners in an effort to do good work, to spur change, and to build better communities. They don't necessarily want to tell you what to do, but they likely have some ideas, experience, and examples that can help you. Always begin your search for funding with a conversation. First ask should not be for money. Your first ask should always be for suggestions or ideas, or to hear things that they've done in the past. You can do it over the phone, by email, or in person. And the foundation program officers are busy as anyone else, right? We're all swamped, we're all overworked, we're all doing 3 or 4 jobs that used to be one person did each job. So know that their time is of as much value as yours, and be patient. You'll have a lot to learn from them, and your project will be better received if it evolves from communication. One thing people with history degrees are good at is telling stories. I always say that that's what our history degrees give us, is the art of BS, really, So, really develop the story that you're trying to tell and be comfortable in that story. Funding organizations want to know the backstory. They want to know the context. They want to know who your players are and what your outcomes are going to be. But they want it to be told to them in an interesting, concise way. So paint them a passionate, engaging picture of what you're asking them to support. The best investment you can make is to take time telling your story, edit your story, refine your story. Bring the story alive and keep them engaged. It's easy to demonstrate how many meals you serve, the children that you've healed, housing units you've built. It's harder to quantify historic preservation. But it's a numbers game, right? Numbers of meals doesn't really mean anything unless you say, we served 1,000 meals to 1,000 school-age children who would have otherwise not eaten. Those are numbers you can understand. Yes, these projects are about saving buildings, but perhaps it's also about creating jobs, stimulating economic recovery, creating economic diversity. Try to quantify it, because that's what many of these funders are looking for. But also talk about how you are moving from A to B, B to C, C to D. How does your project change the game, and describe a world in which that game has changed? I think this is the one that's the most important, right? Know your limits. It often feels like securing the grant, reporting on the grant, and dealing with a donor is harder than actually doing good work you set out to do in the first place. But the reality is that most funders are under as much pressure as you are to meet certain performance measures and outcomes. So if you don't feel like you can do what that grant is requesting you to do in order to get the funds, don't apply for it. Because you want to set yourself up for success in getting other funds. So make sure you can accomplish what you've set out to accomplish, or don't take the money. So let's look at a couple of examples of funding sources, because that's, again, really what you want to know, right? The National Trust is a national example. In addition to general preservation funds, the Trust has in recent years been able to raise substantial funds to redirect to local projects through their programming for African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund and their Sacred Sites Fund. They also have funded places like the Threet Filling Station here in Oklahoma with grants. And did you know that the National Trust has a special pot of money set aside just for Oklahoma? So they do that on a national scale, and in this case, their Oklahoma money is typically geared towards Route 66 items, but they do set aside money specifically for Oklahoma. And they're always calling me and asking me, do I know of any projects? Boy, do I. So make sure you contact me and let me know you're interested. Partners for Sacred Spaces. They're a good example of a resource specific. So in this case, they fund religious properties. We get a lot of calls for churches wanting money to restore churches, and a lot of federal grants don't apply to that. So something like Partners for Sacred Spaces can help out. American Express is one of the largest corporate contributors on the national scale, and it supports a wide range of projects. But as you can imagine, they like to deal directly with funding in markets where they either have a strong customer base or where they're trying to build a customer base. The Jewish American Society for Historic Preservation. Oklahoma has a long history associated with the Julius Rosenwald Fund. The Jewish American Society for Historic Preservation is willing to fund historic markers at all Rosenwald School locations as long as their organization is allowed to put their name on the marker and gets credit in the press releases. So that can be substantial when you're talking about these big metal markers. So as I said, I was asked to condense this way down into a very short amount of time. But I am giving the full presentation on May 4th at the Oklahoma Historical Society at our History Symposium. I think I'm in the afternoon. I don't know what time I'm doing it. But anyway, I'm on the agenda and will be giving a lot more examples and ways in which you can apply these fundings to different types of programs and projects. There's my contact information. To answer Amy's one kind of question that she posed or hope that she got right. CCC, WPA actually had a wide range of people that worked for them, right? From young men who needed to better themselves, as Michael alluded to. Michael, would you have even qualified for that? Probably not. But also, I had the pleasure of working on a project when I worked in South Dakota where women actually built stone bridges, and they were funded through the WPA and the FERA. And so women participated in the construction, they participated in the painting programs, they participated in the writing programs. So it wasn't just a male-dominated movement, it included everyone, because everyone was feeling the problems at the time of no money and needing to feed the family. So, anyone have any questions? Sure. Okay. So the federal government funds projects, right? And our office reviews them. We're required by federal statute to review every federally funded licensed and permitted action across the state of Oklahoma to make sure that they're causing no harm to historic buildings or archaeological sites. So we do see projects that are being done. Not a lot of them have been focused specifically on CCC or WPA, but we are working down at the Chickasaw Rec area on projects there with them, which are CCC, WPA, that kind of thing. We work with the Forest Service on their projects. So we do have some work with them that we're doing currently. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And yeah, we do work with them. Sarah and I have been out there along with some other staff members where these federal agencies are working on larger plans for ways that they approach preservation-related projects. So what are their priorities? What are the funding mechanisms? The one down at the Chickasaw Rec area, they got a very specific amount of money from the federal government to do deferred maintenance. And so that's been a big one that we're working on with them. So yeah, they are working on them. It's just kind of hit or miss right now. Anything else? Yes, sir.
When a private foundation says that they don't take any non-solicited requests,
Mhm.
do they ever reevaluate that, or is that on a
Most,
basis?
I was going to say, most of them have set schedules for when you can apply for grants. So So they don't consider them out of those cycles because they have to allocate their own resources to do review of the applications and things like that. So when you find one, you just need to look at what those schedules are. It may not fit into your time frame, unfortunately. Yes.
Whatever it's worth, in the same category, there is a third organization, CCC, the WPA, but the PWA, Public Works Administration, is pretty noteworthy for us because that's what University of Central Oklahoma is dealing with.
Hmm.
Where they originated. So locally, we would probably want to think about that group too.
Well, and the other presentation that I would have given today, if we had more time, is one that I call Alphabet Soup. There's probably about 30 programs, right, that are all typically 3 letters, from WPA to PWA to FERA to NRA to, I mean, there's a lot of them. And many of them are building programs. Other ones might be the arts programs where you see murals that were painted in public facilities. So those are things too that we have a lot of information about in our own collection about those murals, and we can connect people with how to get those restored or repaired in their communities too. Okay. All right, so according to my notes, are there other announcements?
10-minute break.
All right, then please be back promptly at 2 o'clock for our next session.
1:55.
Okay, never mind, 1:55. I'm reading your notes to me. Well, there you go.
All right, let's get rolling on our last hour of the day. So it is my job to now take what we've been learning today and do a little bit of assimilation and a call to action. What are the next steps for you personally, for you and your site, for us as a state? So I'm going to be kind of guiding you through that. I hope that you've been inspired by something one of the historians said. And this is just the starting point. This is a starting conversation. All these speakers could have talked for 3 more hours each. There are things that you did not get today that you wanted, and we know that. So we're hoping to take this to the next step and be able to do this again. But first off, I think that all of us are here today because we have some kind of story. And Lynda talked about the importance of storytelling. Why are you here? Why did you take a Thursday to care about some site, maybe a piece of art, something about your family history? Those are the stories that people want to hear about. You know, when we work on museum exhibits, we can hang things on the wall and put them in cases, but if people don't know what they are or why they are special or important, then we've wasted an opportunity. So, shortly, I'm going to ask you to be thinking about your personal stories and the things that you would want to share with people you know about why this piece of history interests you. I have had the great fortune of working in 2 New Deal buildings, and actually for a lot of my adult life, I've kind of rubbed shoulders with 1930s history. Didn't see that coming when I was younger, but it started back in high school. So I'm going to share with you real quickly my story of why I'm here and why I care about these sites. When I was in high school, I was doing a project I had to give a 30-minute speech. As a high schooler, that was completely intimidating. And so I picked a topic that I thought was really interesting, was 1940s radio. And for some reason, I liked listening to the stories on the radio. That was before podcasts. That was back in the 1980s when I had to listen to them on KOMA radio at night, Sunday nights at midnight, is when I heard things like Fibber McGee and Molly and Abbott and Costello, and I started falling in love with that piece of history. Well, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and I realized they heard them when they were original, the first time. And so I started picking their brain. So my high school, I guess, thesis, you would call it, was about 1940s radio. But in talking to my grandparents, I learned a lot about the Great Depression, because they were born or lived or grew up during that era. And they would talk about the things like not having chapstick or covering their faces with wet cloths to keep the dust out. They would talk about how that in the evenings people sat around and talked or played games or went to bed. They didn't watch TV. And I thought that was so fascinating and interesting. So I did this project not realizing that a few years later in college, I would need to write a history thesis. And so I picked the Dust Bowl. It seemed like kind of an easy topic since we're right here in Oklahoma. So I went to some of the local nursing homes and reached out to many of those people were still alive. This was 30 years ago, and told me the stories of the Dust Bowl. And I was so fascinated that that's kind of my launch into history. And I didn't realize I was evolving into a historian. In fact, the paper, I put this in here real quick at the last minute because I published the thesis recently because so many people have asked me about that history, and there are quotes from people all over Oklahoma. So if you're interested in going and reading my college thesis, it's pretty interesting. I have a lot of quotes from my grandparents in there. Oh, I didn't even tell you. That first picture, that's my grandpa when he was a baby in the late 1920s. And my grandma, that was her school picture in the early 30s. And then the other, my other grandparents who lived on a farm in Blue, Oklahoma, over by Durant. So then I get a teaching job. I worked for a few years as a teacher, and then I head to the Oklahoma City Zoo to be the lead educator, not knowing I was going to become the zoo's historian. But I found this photo rather fascinating. This was a photo of a bathhouse that had been built by the CCC, which I didn't really know what that meant back then either. But it was right along Zoo Lake. This was where people went swimming before there were public swimming pools. And so you can see the worker, there's a worker up there on the roof. You can tell he's a very young guy. And I have some other photos where they have the horses that they use. And so these young men were living in a camp at the zoo building infrastructure. And that was in 1933 and 34. Well, then in 1935, they started using not CCC boys, but the WPA workers. And they built those grottos. If you've been to the zoo, do you remember the pits that you looked down into or you looked across and they were behind these deep rock stones? They were called grottos. Those were built by the WPA workers, and they're still there. They're still being used. They still have animals in them, even though they've modified them to make them more suitable to today's practices. So now they have grass in them and trees and things that they didn't maybe when I was a kid, and maybe what you remember as well. So inadvertently, I started kind of falling in love with that history, that time period. I went to Washington, D.C., like Kyle did, and did some research on some of the things that happened at the zoo and realized, wow, right here in the middle of the state, we have all this cool stuff. Sherry, she and I worked together for years gathering this information and sharing it at the Zooseum. That was once we got the bathhouse restored because it was just being used for storage for the Haunt the Zoo props. And we thought, oh, wouldn't that make a great museum? And the zoo administrators got behind that. We got a wonderful donor and some grant money and restored that building. And there it is on dedication day and gave it new life. We call it rehabilitation, where you take a building that had one purpose, like an armory, and then you rehab it into something else and make it viable and usable again. Many of the sites that maybe you're thinking of or have come from, that's already been done too. But we're constantly thinking, how do we get people in the door and care about these sites? Because if you just restore a rock structure outside and it doesn't mean anything to anyone, there's a better chance of it being lost. Okay, so we named this building the Zooseum, and Sherry and I ran the exhibits out of there for a long time. This is the dedication when we got it put on the National Historic Register. I'm super proud of that. And I just had no idea that 20 years of my life would get all wrapped up into the 1930s. So that was a lot of fun. And then Sherry and Kyle and I started realizing that his CC camp and my CC camp worked to, they started at the zoo and they went to his park, and we just uncovered some wonderful histories. So moving on, then I came here 6 years ago, and once again, I'm working in another sandstone building, and I love it. I'm working in the office of, I guess, the commander of the National Guard, and I'm aware of that. I walk in that office and know that I might just be doing paperwork today or a Facebook post, but there were men in that office that made some really tough decisions, life-changing decisions. These are people that worked in that office, sent men to war, and some of them didn't come back. So I feel that history every day. And that's important. And I want other people to know that, because when I have 45th Infantry people walk in the halls, they want to talk about their memories of this place. And they're not going to be around much longer. So we've got to capture those stories while we can. So this building was built in 36 by WPA workers, as well as the structures that you saw in the park. I like this photo because this shows the 45th right outside the building here, which now is right across from a bunch of restaurants. But then it was just a bunch of land, and they were getting ready to go off to war. So I've kind of had this history of digging into 1930s, the life and how people lived. And then last year, my dad was digging through some of my grandparents' papers and found this photo. This is my grandpa. He was in World War II. He used to drive the commander around. And I knew that. Didn't know much about it, but I knew that. And then he found the piece of paper that said that my grandpa was a CCC boy. I didn't know. Here I have had an entire career talking about CCC, and I did not know my own family had that legacy. So maybe there's other stories like that in this room. Maybe you have some kind of connection like that. I think that it's the storytelling that's going to keep this history alive and relevant. But we have to get it out there. We have to make other people care about these buildings and want to care. And today is when we start doing that. We start talking about, how do we make people care? And it's going to need to be a bigger effort than just us individually, in my opinion. I found a great quote from Helen Keller last night when she said, "Alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much." And maybe the people in this room are the ones that are ready to take the next step and talk about, how can we bring more attention to this time in history, to our sites, to what Oklahoma has to offer. For the rest of our session today, I'm going to ask you to come out of your comfort zone just a little bit. You've been networking and sharing stories, but I didn't get to hear any of those because I've been busy coordinating and running things. But if you would, we're going to do a series of things. I'd like for you to take a few moments to write down, maybe in your little note packet or on a piece of paper, your ideas of what we could do as a state to march toward that centennial that's coming and do it well so that we're sharing those stories for other people. Inside of your packet, there's one page, it's called the ideas page. And on the left column, there are some ideas that we as a committee have kind of talked about, like maybe we need to have more of these sessions. And a couple of people in the room have already come to me and said, I would be interested in hosting another one like this. We can dig into different pieces of the history. Someone from the north and someone from the south. So I just need someone from the east to step forward, and maybe we can do some more of this. But maybe it's talking about the Route 66 passport. It worked really well for that centennial. Maybe we could come up with something similar where people go to different WPA sites throughout the state. And I know all of you will want to make sure your area is on that passport or whatever it could be. Maybe we need some kind of marketing campaign. I feel like based on the comments I got from the Oklahoma Tourism Department staff today, they've been thinking about this for a while. And here we have a group mobilized and ready to go, and we can work together to make something really wonderful. But I know that many of you in this room are power thinkers. The kind of people that need to ruminate, put some thought into things. We might not come up with those answers today. But if I give you 5 minutes on our very fancy timer clock to quietly jot down some of your brainstorms that maybe then we can share with each other in a little bit, would you do me the honor of giving us some of your power thinking? Okay? It's no secret that when Sherry and Kyle and I first started talking about the symposium and then brought Lynda on, we wanted to bring people like you together and enlarge our circle of influence, but we had so much trouble coming up with a name for this workshop. And I'm still not sure it was a great one. We just struggled with the language. We thought, are there any non-historians who even know what the word New Deal means? Well, I started asking some friends and family. Nobody had a clue what I was talking about. Okay. There are a lot of people that don't know WPA, CCC. They don't know what those mean. So based on the feedback, we had all kinds of ideas for this. I sent out a press release and had several people proof it. Still, one lady called me. She was here earlier today, but she's not here now, so I'm going to tell on her. She called. She said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And this is a very intelligent person. This piece of history, the language is just not out there. So I know that this is a challenge. When you hear the phrase, the Route 66 centennial is coming, you know what that means, but not the New Deal centennial is coming. So this is one of our challenges, is an awareness campaign and getting that language out there. I think that the reason the Trust gave us funding today is because they know that 2033, 34, 35 is coming. They're already thinking about it. So we've got 9 years to start helping people understand what this phrase New Deal means. But again, I think that it all comes back to storytelling and why you care. So if you would be so kind as to take a few moments, whoops, did I lose Mike? Take a few moments and maybe group up with a table or two and just share your story. I'm not asking for anything groundbreaking. I just think that there are some of you who have not connected yet that maybe you just need to say, here is why I'm here real quick. Could you do that for me? And then we're going to come back and we're going to figure out a plan. Okay? Just take a moment, turn around to a table behind you, beside you. You feel free to jump over, move the tables together. It's fine.